Reading and recording sermon notes is one of the first things I usually do on Monday morning. Did you know that, acolytes? One of the first things, I start my week out by reading sermon notes, so make them good. Confirmation students are asked to write a brief summary of the message they heard in the sermon, and then to answer this question: what difference does this make for my life? Now, one of my confirmation students from a previous call wrote the same thing, the same answer on every one of his sermon notes, all 3 years in confirmation. His answer to what difference does this make for my life was more blessed. That's it. More blessed. Well, at first I thought, well, that's so nice. But over time I became frustrated with his answer. More blessed. What did he mean by more blessed? And what does it mean to be more blessed? To feel more privileged? To feel more fortunate? Was he really applying the sermon message to his life? And even when I wrote, "Tell me how you are more blessed," he never did. Was he telling me how the message made him feel? Maya Angelou once said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Is it really possible he felt more blessed by every single sermon he heard me preach? I wonder what my preaching professor would say about that. Probably, "You preach too much gospel and not enough law." Well, we prefer the gospel or good news for ourselves, but who is the gospel for? Did he hear the gospel for himself and the law for everyone else? Did he only hear what he wanted to hear? And once he heard the good news, once he heard what he wanted to hear, did his ears shut off and he stopped listening? So I'm asking all of you this morning, do my sermons ever stretch you beyond your comfort zone? Do we feel more blessed by every sermon we hear? Forget the words. It's all about how we feel, right? Well, sermons are more than comfort food. They need to move us out of our comfort zone, beyond our complacency, to boldly live out our baptismal callings, which are to proclaim Christ through word and deed, to care for others in the world God made, and to work for justice and peace. Living out our baptismal callings isn't always easy. In fact, sometimes it's just plain hard. And we wonder, why does it have to be so hard, so difficult? Well, in my sermon study this week, I came across this story I want to share with you. I don't know if it's a true story or not, and it really doesn't matter, but I think it applies to today's gospel lesson. One day, a man walked into a bookstore to return a purchase. "It's a Bible," he said, handing it to the clerk at the cash register. "Was it a gift?" the clerk asked. "No, I bought it for myself," the man said. "Well, didn't you like the translation or the format?" the clerk asked. "Oh, no," the man said. "The format was clear and the translation was fine." The clerk asked, "Well, I need to write down a reason for this return." "In that case," said the man, "write down that there is a lot in that book which is tough to swallow." There are parts of God's word that are more tough to swallow than others. There are parts of God's word that are difficult to understand. There are parts of God's word that hit too close to home. And there are parts of God's word that do both. Today's gospel lesson is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, and I've always found it troubling and challenging to preach a sermon on a sermon. Perhaps the best thing for me to have done would have been to simply read Jesus' sermon from beginning to finish, sit down, and allow time for us to contemplate it. And sometimes the lectionary does us a great disservice by stopping short, like it does today. A third of the way through Jesus' sermon, and I read on from what the lectionary assigned. How are we to interpret Jesus' words? Literally or figuratively? We tend to mesh the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew's Gospel with the Sermon on the Plain from Luke's Gospel, but they are quite different. The Sermon on the Mount contains only blessings, while the Sermon on the Plain, the one I read this morning, contains blessings and woes. The blessings are a reversal, like we hear in Mary's Magnificat, like we sing in the offertory song, Give Thanks. The poor are made rich, the weak are made strong because of what Jesus has done. Jesus came to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, to give sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. And the woes serve as warnings. They should cause us to sit up straight, to take notice, to take to heart our blessedness and the blessedness of others. So are we content with our blessedness? Are we content with the blessedness of others? And how do we measure blessedness? As long as we have, is it okay that others have not? God challenges us, calls us out of our comfort and complacency to do what isn't comfortable. God calls us to radical, yes, radical generosity and love with both our words and our actions. And what is that I've said in confirmation, girls? There's other confirmation students here. Our lips and our hips must match. They've been listening. Still, we think Jesus can't be serious, right? It's all exaggeration, that wonderful word hyperbole, right? Does Jesus really expect us to give more to someone who steals from us? Are we to give until it hurts? And that thing about giving without expecting anything in return? Now, seriously. That's not the way the world lives, but we live in a fallen world. In his Sermon on the Plain, Jesus is calling for change. Not something small or easy, not something barely noticeable, but something big. Not this big, but this big and beyond. Jesus doesn't set us up for failure either, and nor does he ask us to do the impossible. For with God, all things are possible. With God's help, we can love our neighbors as ourselves. We can love our enemies with words and actions. We can do unto others as we would have them do unto us. With God's help, we can be instruments of change in this broken world. With God's help, we can be merciful just as our Father is merciful. And we can live out our baptismal identity, living generously and graciously toward others as our Father lives toward us. And when we do, what will we be? More blessed.